Welcome and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. On the program today, we're going to be talking about leadership. After all, as many of us approach midlife, we certainly have gathered a nice array of experiences that should inevitably put us in that position. So whether you're someone who's on the job as a mid-level manager, someone who's decided you want to go into business for themselves, or perhaps you're one of those volunteers that works for an organization that sometimes looks like it just kind of went off course and maybe needs to be redirected. Joining us on the program today, we're going to be talking about what's known as the Matrix Experience. It's Matrix Leadership, in fact. And our guest today founded Matrix Leadership back in 1990, and she has more than 30 years of experience in training, consulting, facilitation, and coaching. She's going to be joining us here today to talk about what this modality of leadership means and how it can apply to you so that you can develop techniques that can help you to become more effective, connected with any group that you can imagine. And I'd like to welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program today our guest, Miss Amina Nolan. Amina, thank you for joining us here on the program today.
Hi, Daniel. It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Now, tell us, what got you moving in this direction more than 30 years ago, give or take? I know the answer will seem obvious when you look at hundreds of years of hierarchical leadership, so to speak, the sort of do as I say, not as I do modality, and the frustration that can come with that. I suppose there was probably some sort of a change on the horizon somewhere, wasn't there?
Well, certainly, and I think to be very honest, I think I started training in how to work with groups because I wasn't particularly good at it in the beginning. I was very natively good at working with individuals, and my background was in holistic health and counseling psychology. But I had a draw to groups. I had an interest in them. And so it's a kind of an example, I think, of you teach what you need to learn. But you're certainly right in commenting on that as the work developed. It's very much become about creating an alternative to the hierarchical models that we're all steeped in this culture, hierarchical models of leadership. And so, yeah, I'm very passionate about that currently.
I could imagine. Now, taking a look at a lot of the literature, books, CDs, training programs, do you see how what you have to present is different, and in what way, if in fact it is?
Well, it's radically different in one way, and then I'd say that influences everything else. When I talk about matrix leadership to people who are not familiar with it, I usually say there's three different lenses you can look through to understand it. And one of them, which is part of what you're pointing to, is that it really radically redefines the whole concept of leadership. So in all of those books and CDs and training programs that you mentioned, most all of them are aimed at the individual leader, developing the individual as a leader, even if they're including that a good leader is a good follower, right? So in matrix leadership, we shift our whole understanding of leadership, that it's no longer something that resides in the individual only, but it's something that arises through the synergy or the collaboration of everyone on the team or in the classroom or whatever the group setting. So the relationship is embedded not in the individual. The leadership is embedded not in the individual, but in the relationships, and beyond that, into the whole group of relationships. So it's a highly collaborative model in its essence and in its practice.
Amina, this is what comes to mind for me. And I think of that wonderful film back in 1973, Robert Redford and, of course, Paul Newman, The Sting.
Oh,
Can that kind of fall in line of what you're talking about here?
Well, give me a little bit more of how you're...
Okay, well, The Sting, obviously it was about Robert Redford's character who wants redemption because a friend of his was killed. And the reason is because there was the big gangster that discovered they had actually stolen some money, and so
Yes.
they wanted redemption. Of course, they create the sting. Now, of course, Paul Newman basically is sort of leading it, but you kind of see everybody falling into the roles, where they kind of take individual leadership and collaboratively as a whole take this guy down, through a sting.
That's a great analogy. I mean, if you really get that it takes, in any context, like, say, an executive team or even a high school classroom, it takes all styles and types of leadership to get the intelligence of the whole. One of my most fun examples, my daughter, who's a young 27-year-old now, coached high school varsity girls basketball while taking the training, actually, in matrix leadership. And she turned a very green, losing team into a team that went all the way to win regionals. And they all credited to learning these kind of leadership and communication practices so that they could work as a team, and instead of feeling competitive with each other, they really began to get this concept that you're pointing to, that they needed every type of intelligence, and one wasn't better than the other. So it's exactly that on one level, of course.
Now, talk about what this communication is, how you go to facilitate people to be able to sort of get into the groove of this matrix experience.
Yeah, that's another way that I talk about it to people, or people experience it, is that it is, in its core and in practice, on the functional side, a set of communication practices or tools that actually support us to function in the interconnected way, that we know, most of us now know we're interconnected, but our communication norms don't support that. Our communication norms come out of these hierarchical paradigms that you mentioned, and things like competition, win, lose, either or. So
the Enron model, in other words.
Exactly.
I love watching that documentary, The Smartest Guys in the Room, because there's one point where a guy says, if there's something I'm told to do and it means this for me and I have to step on someone, I'm going to stomp on the guy's throat. I'm like, boy, there's a culture thriving.
That is exactly the culture I'm speaking about, and it's extreme, of course, but we're all steeped in it. We're steeped in, we have to debate, we have to win-lose, we have to fragment into subgroups and, our whole political system. But I better not go down that road. To return to your question, the communication practices start, the number one, there are 6 of them that we consider sort of essential. The first one is something so simple and yet so odd in our culture that if you imagine sitting in a committee or a management team right now, or even a family, and instead of speaking to the group, right, where you're making contact with everybody, or instead of speaking to the leader or the teacher, we actually begin to train people to speak to a particular person, sort of pair by pair. Now that can get quite spontaneous and quite fluid, but instead of speaking to everyone, I'm speaking to you if you were sitting and you're responding, and somebody else might jump in. And if you could imagine, let's say we had a committee or a team of 6 people, then every person in there has 5 potential communication channels. So if we could diagram this, you'd begin to see something that looked like a web or a network of person-to-person, we call it, communication channels that were actually developing the capacity to talk to each other in the open, or I like to say in the group, I like to say in the eyes and ears of the whole of the group, so that we're getting the capacity to talk about things when they get perhaps more challenging, when we have more differences or, external threats coming in. So this very foundation is based on starting to talk to each other in the open. And that's just number one. But that's, and it's very simple to say. And when people start doing it, they typically think it could feel awkward or rude because we're so trained to look at everyone and, then leave the group and say what we really think to the people we're closest to.
So basically it sounds to me, Mina, like you really encourage authentic, this is really what's on my mind communication.
Yes. Although, yes, absolutely. That, and in the open, so transparency, authenticity. Now, with that said, we don't, principle number 2, actually, or tool number 2, is that we slow people down a bit in the sense of encouraging people to start the communication or start their meeting or start forming a new group with things that are more relationship building. So they're still person to person and they're still very authentic and sincere, but we have this principle we call ground of health, which literally means let's get to know each other in sort of the things that are extraordinary in our lives, the things that light us up, the things that bring us joy or satisfaction or keep us healthy. And if we can start there, or things like appreciation, if we can start there, we're actually building some resiliency and adaptability into that web of relationships. Still very authentic, we don't say things just to get points or something.
Mm-hmm.
And then what we are doing, exactly as you suggested, if we start with that ground of well-being or health, then when we get to the deeper things that are harder to say to each other in the open, we have the money in the bank for that. We have our relationships built where they have the capacity that we can actually start to value differences, which is another one of our principles. We can start to understand that differences aren't threatening, they're not win-lose, but they're actually essential to our creativity and to being innovative and adaptive and all of that. So, yes, very much about authenticity, transparency, and eventually heart. About we come to, it's a highly inclusive methodology, so it really prevents people, regardless of their style or their typical role, it really prevents people from feeling marginalized. Everyone ends up feeling valued and supported and seen and heard. So, of course, a lot of heartful, love or appreciation or support develops as well.
Now, do you think this is something, Amina, that is, I guess, a challenge for Americans? And the reason I say that is that I have talked with people of different cultures around the world, and for the most part it seems that, maybe it's just me and my experience, but I've noticed that they tend to, these other cultures, be very direct about what they have to say. And in fact, other people may observe, as you had mentioned earlier, this seems to be kind of crass or rude, but it's just the style. It's kind of in your face. That in America we tend to tone, water, and sugarcoat all these things down. And if so, would that also be the reason there's so much sarcasm in America?
I have a couple answers to your question. It's a great question, fascinating question. First of all, I have to say, of course, there are many different subcultures in America, in the U.S.
Right.
So that if African heritage people or Jewish culture, Jewish people were in their own culture, they're much more direct. New Yorkers may be, and of course this can be stereotypical, so it's not everyone, but as a culture can be much more direct than, say, where I was raised initially in the South. So having said that there are very many different subcultures in the U.S., and of course there are people who study this and the traits of different racial cultures and all sorts of things. My strongest experience of working out of the U.S. right now is with in Russia, and that's fascinating. They are the people that I'm getting to work with, which is ranging from other consultants and coaches to business, managers and CEOs and owners. I would say that they are they are eager to learn matrix. And admittedly, now here's a thing, too, about culture. They are often, I'm getting to work with 30-year-olds, or early 40s and even late 20s. And I would say as a generation, but I would say also as a culture in Russia, they are so eager for this that they take it up very quickly. And this could be a thing of so do college students in this country, I find, the 20-year-olds and early 30s or 30-year-olds. They take it up very quickly, like they already know it has to be different. Mm-hmm. And so I'm not, I do think as Americans it all depends on the context. Like in some corporate boardrooms, they are so aggressive that I have to get them to sort of back up and slow down and find out that their kids love to play soccer or whatever it is, or just to get them to express their appreciations for each other so that, they actually know they have that kind of positive regard for each other before they go into their deepest challenges. And then on the other hand, I certainly work with the subgroups that you're talking about, and I myself was probably more conditioned to, quote, be polite. So, and differences were better unspoken, right? If you didn't agree, just don't say anything. So I've certainly trained myself, to be, again, with the right, with enough investment in the relationship to be much more open and authentic and transparent. Which is another one of our principles, by the way. One of those essential communication practices is all about redefining feedback, because feedback in every Western culture, at least, and probably many others, is equated with criticism and that very essence of top-down, authority. So learning to give what we call differentiating feedback, which means most feedback that's challenging is really about a difference. In addition to learning to really speak out loud the appreciative feedback, that's another very key principle that relates very much to being more authentic and transparent.
Now, you touched on something that I find interesting because there are ways to look at it, too, when it comes to communication. It's, well, there are some things that should just be left unsaid, for instance. Okay, now that's one thing, okay? Then the idea of being polite, speak when it's your turn. And that, to me, is one that I'd like to touch on because I see so often people who will sit there and they will listen to someone, and this someone will be babbling away and spend 15, 20, 30 minutes really not saying much of anything. And you'll watch this person sit there and just take it and politely, yeah, and you can just tell they'd rather be somewhere else. And a lot of times I've even approached this, even with friends. I said, they ask, well, how is it that you're able to kind of walk away? I said, because I know how to cut somebody off. Basically, I'll even get to the point, I'm not interested anymore, and it will seem rude. But and so the expression goes, well, don't you think that's rude? And I said, what's rude is when someone lacks the consideration to realize by not paying attention to body language that you're boring the hell out of them. It's rude for you to sit there and have to listen to that stuff, to me, anyway. But there are very tactful, good ways to cut. I'd love to talk with you more about this. You put a finger, because most of the time these people don't care if you tell them to shut up. But, what kind of things, how do you work with that?
Well, that's such a great example and opportunity for Matrix because, first of all, I actually have two answers again. Level one answer is that if people are functioning in a Matrix way, person by person, the third principle of one of the ones that we teach as essential is that everyone in that team or that group has to become aware, keyword, from your example, and responsible for making sure that all of the communication channels, all of the connections, and that means every individual, are in, not, equally in every group meeting or something, but that everybody's voice is being heard. So what that translates to is that of course, we all come in with native styles. Some people are talkers, they're extroverts, they're used to being in charge, whatever. Other people tend to sit back and, observe, and we get the intelligence of the quiet people. But in Matrix, that quickly balances out, because someone who's used to talking, as you're suggesting, and just on a roll, and they lose track of their impact on other people, and they're not actually tracking and noticing. Then in Matrix, they very quickly learn that they have to also notice who else hasn't spoken yet. And furthermore, if we only have 30 minutes or an hour for this meeting, they can't take up 10 minutes of it on a roll.
Right.
That's one half of the equation. And on the other half of the equation, if everyone is beginning to work in this, communicate in this Matrix fashion, there are two other opportunities. One is for someone else to say, hey, Jim, you've been talking for quite a while, and Susan over here, I'm missing your voice. What are you thinking about? And number three is for the person who's the quiet recipient of that verbal barrage when it's, before it's moderated. And I would say, again, I've been the person who, if I wasn't in charge, I'd tend to sit back and be quiet. So I had to learn many of these techniques you're talking about, and I would simply say, I learned to simply say, hey, I'm losing you, or I'm losing you because you've said the same thing, 3 or 4 times, and I'm getting aware that, again, Susan over here hasn't spoken, or I'd like to get my voice in. So just learning to speak up and say, hey, I'm losing you, or I'm finding myself distracted, or I'd like to hear what you're saying, but you lost me, back at that example, and actually I want to respond, or I want to hear from so-and-so. Mm-hmm. So it gets to be, I think, the amazing thing, really, as simple as it sounds, it's pretty fun to see it in action, is that responsibility gets shared, and everyone starts to wake up to that sort of phenomenon of unconscious, I like to call it unconscious dominance.
Mm-hmm. Like we all get to jump in the swimming pool and play together, so to speak.
Yeah.
Because I've noticed one of the other areas where a person can become dominated is on telephone conversations. Mm-hmm. And goodness gracious, I'm sure you've been on the phone with somebody, and they're trying to convince you to a way, and they just will keep going and going and going. And you think, okay, what is the proper etiquette here? But at the second point is the proper etiquette is get this person to shut up for a minute, and you've got other things to do, maybe.
Well, you're really talking about, and one-on-one, of course, we don't have evidence.
Mm-hmm. No, I'm sure.
More so on the telephone.
But those kind of habits will spill over to groups, won't they?
Oh, yeah, of course. So what I'm thinking about is you're giving that one-on-one example on the telephone, and all the same principles apply, by the way, to a relationship or a couple as they do to a group. You're really talking about that we don't have the mechanisms in our communication norms culturally for giving feedback. For saying, hey, Susan, when you keep talking, it's been like 15 minutes nonstop. The impact for me is I'm really losing you. And I either need to respond or, let's cut the call a little shorter. So you're really saying I'd prefer that this conversation go back and forth a little bit more. But that's so out of the norm to just give on-the-spot feedback without a big build-up or without a structured, meet in my office or let me give you your quarterly report or whatever. But you're really talking about feedback. We need to be able to give feedback in the moment when it's happening. And then we'll get along much better. We'll be able to tune our relationships to what works for both of us. Mm-hmm. That's certainly a long ways from being, the normal in our communication patterns. And it is a form of dominance to talk on and lose track of the other person.
Now, Amina, as you've conducted these workshops, I'm sure that you've had all sorts of managers, leaders, and maybe even business owners more than 30 years you've been doing this, who have participated in these workshops. How has their change been, the transformation you've seen, and how it's actually changed their culture and perhaps even their company and the way that they do things?
Mhm. Oh, I can think of so many examples. One that was really comes to mind was in an executive team to start with, and the CEO tended to be very dominant. He was very bright and very smart and a great CEO, but he was also very quick. I think he was a New Yorker, an ex-stockbroker, and he moved at warp speed times 10. And the second most dominant person was the CFO. And often there'd be a whole meeting with many people just sitting back. They couldn't get a word in edgewise. So in working with them, after getting them to communicate in this person-to-person fashion first, which does slow them down, and doing some of the relationship-building things I talk about, I actually got them to work with another matrix essential principle, which is that they differentiate from or change their typical roles, the typical behaviors and functions. So in a training exercise, I actually coached the CEO to sit back and facilitate others getting, interacting. And he did that brilliantly. And I also simultaneously, and the group didn't know who had these experiments, these coaching experiments, there was I think it was the chief IT officer who was a quieter guy, tended to sit back. I coached him. His experiment was to jump in with new ideas. So you can kind of get the idea. And it radically changed their culture, and they got it immediately. The CEO realized that he actually loved sitting back and getting to harvest others' ideas and getting to facilitate, that he was actually good at it. The IT guy, pretty early on in this training session, jumped in with a kind of out-of-the-box idea that nobody had thought of, and so many of the more marginalized or quieter voices got in, and they were completely blown away. And it did have a radical impact in their culture, and that's, of course, just one example. I've certainly, another organization that I work with just once a week, now I just completed my 14th year, and they're a healthcare organization, international, and they're all medical educators, mostly medical schools or large teaching hospitals. For them, it has gotten them so aware of the gender dynamics. Of course, the field of medicine used to be dominated by men, so the women are much more engaged, more active. They consider that they communicate their differences as well as their appreciation much more openly, much more authentically. They resolve conflicts in a matrix as a whole radically different way of completely redefines conflict. And they have even said to me that their organization probably wouldn't still be in business if they hadn't learned matrix leadership. So that's just a few examples. I've seen an organization go from on the verge of scapegoating the manager, this was a whole department in a city government, to where they all began to look at the things that they didn't want to look at in themselves, and so therefore were kind of blaming the manager. So I could just sit here and tell way too many stories and get
I'm sure of that, believe me. Here's an example that we can use since it's so today. And okay, first lend your view, your opinion, and then maybe we'll just kind of see how it goes. The Apprentice. Donald Trump's The Apprentice. What are your thoughts about that leadership, if you even watch the show?
I don't watch the show. I'm sorry. You have to fill me in a little bit, and then I can probably respond.
Well, basically what he's been doing lately is he gathers together celebrities, and then he, of course, divides them into two teams. Before it used to be men versus women, but in a fair amount of cases, unfortunately, the women kept losing big in the beginning, so he had to mix them up. It's just the way it was turning out. But now he's decided to mix them up. But the bottom line is, you perform as a team on a task, and whoever, the winning team is, obviously they win, and then the leader of that team, the project manager, they get to donate the money that was raised to the charity of their choice. Now, what's funny about this, though, is that you've got the losing team. They come into the boardroom, and three people ultimately end up in the boardroom where one of them will be fired. So on the one hand, you're promoting teamwork, but on the other hand, you're promoting a backstabbing environment.
Wow.
Because ultimately, everybody's going to get bumped off until ultimately there's the apprentice that works with Donald Trump. And I look at this, and I think to myself, well, this is just so American, though. Nobody would ever get anything done because too many people are worried about, well, geez, if I fail at my point, am I going to be ganged up on and kicked out? And it sounds to me like that's way far from what matrix leadership really enhances, obviously.
Obviously.
But since you don't watch the show, then I guess there wouldn't be a way for you to really have much of an opinion on it.
Just what you're saying about it, it reminds me of, several. Reality TV shows right now are big, big sellers, and what you're describing is so, I think I better watch it.
Don't watch it. Beyond 50 doesn't believe in watching it. Just spit it out. We're big on matrix leadership here and honesty, So.
Well, you're describing something that just gets my stomach to turn, where on the one hand it is requiring people to, as you said, be a team in order to solve the problem, but then the whole time amping up this cutthroat win-lose competition where that, it could be you that goes, and that's got to be inciting some, maybe I'll just call them shadow dynamics, and that is the antithesis of matrix leadership. You're absolutely right. So that's fascinating.
But I think what's interesting when I see and consider what you've been describing here in matrix leadership is this. They were principles that I basically kind of learned on my own through leaders throughout the years and have implemented. And the idea was this, that let's say, for instance, I may have a team of people, okay, and ultimately the decision falls to me. That's the way it is.
Right.
But on the other hand, what I would show the group is I'm willing to be in there in the middle of the work because it's, needing to be done. The second thing is, here are the standards the company is looking for. Now, this is a way that I achieve this standard. However, whatever ideas you may have to get you to this standard, I'm all ears. If you find a better way to do it, an easier way to do it, whatever it is, this is the end result I'm looking for. And when people would share ideas, and I'd say, that's really interesting, and then I might even gather a few other people. Take a look at this. Now, how does this work again so that other people could see this might help them with a shortcut? Eventually, you couldn't get people to stop giving ideas, and their enthusiasm for being at the job would just go through the roof, and the ultimate end result that I had from these people was self-motivation. And I even had managers say, how do you get these people to do it? I said, I don't get them to do anything. They choose to do it. And to me, that would make a manager's job just so easy, I guess.
Well, it sounds inspiring, and like you are and were an inspired leader, and you're absolutely right. You're pointing to kind of the intersection of matrix leadership and hierarchy, and we're actually not looking to do away with all hierarchy, right?
No.
There is, the CEO or the manager, the buck stops here, or even the parent, of course, in a family group. But if you can get the kinds of things you're talking about, and in Matrix we might be adding where people are actually meeting and speaking to one another in the group and giving feedback and supporting each other to change that habit or that pattern or that limiting behavior. But all the things you're saying, that you're empowering the team to bring forth their own intelligence and creativity, and that's where synergy comes from, right? When all those different ideas are interacting, and emergence. I mean, we know this from physics and biology and chemistry that evolution and change and the innovation, the new idea that's going to actually work in the ever-changing, environment comes from all of these different intelligences interacting together. And then you're absolutely right. People are highly engaged, and, the job satisfaction or the classroom satisfaction goes way up. And we have a saying in Matrix. It's probably a little the softer side. But we talk about it, not necessarily in the business world, but we talk about it in communities, for example, as also it's a heart awakening. And in business, I just talk about that as collaboration or synergy, where the group itself and that synergy there starts to be so much connection and open communication and in the right environment, love, that actually it becomes our teacher, or even in a community setting, I might say our guru, right, where that much openness and communication is going to show all of us not only what's the new best direction, and an insightful and responsive leader is going to recognize that, as you're talking about, but it also shows us where, this old pattern of mine is just not serving anymore, and this old belief of mine just isn't true. I got to, it's just like that much connection and love and openness and support sort of dissolve anything unlike our highest selves. And so that's a whole nother level. But what you're suggesting is a beautiful example. Sounds like you were an amazing leader, and actually doing, empowering that kind of synergistic, collaborative teamwork.
Because I think there's nothing more frustrating to a group of people than, especially with somebody who comes from the outside or who haphazardly participates in the day or even the moment-to-moment activities of what's going on, comes in and says, I just don't like the way you're doing it, crashes in, and then decides to change everything. And, it's like, well, you haven't been here all day. You've been sitting in the office. Now you're trying to jump in the middle of this nonsense and then tell us what we're not doing that satisfies you. And it's people like that you just kind of want to take out to the back and say, why don't you just stay here for the rest of the year? But I'm sure you've encountered that kind of thing, and the amount of frustration and aggravation, like the regional managers who come into a grocery store, for instance. I've seen this as a customer. This is the way this needs to be, and you can just look at the frustration on these people behind the counter like, this guy shows up out of the blue from corporate, doesn't have any idea what's going on here in this environment or this community for that matter, and you can just see like they're just throwing a meteorite into something.
Yeah, of course, that happens all the time. And even as a consultant, I was trained, and still do sometimes, to go, to conduct individual interviews, right, or survey, and get everybody's, intelligence that way. And a step beyond that, which I much prefer now if I have the time, if the company will give me the amount of time, is to get people to talk to each other with me in the room, and they all get to say what's going on. And I always know now as an external consultant that I don't know what's going on, that the intelligence is in the room, and the best thing I can do is build the culture, the capacity, and the communication and the leadership to be able to really talk to each other about, how things are impacting them, how their relationships are going, how they're working together, and then start to get those differences and innovations in the room. And that is far different than, in fact, I guess I've always been allergic to the kind of program. That's not to say that they don't add some value, that comes in and is kind of a cookbook approach, and here's what we've developed, and you're going to learn this. That has a place, but I'm much more interested in just what you're pointing toward, is going in and actually there. I always say you're the experts. You're the experts on what's going on here. I'm only here to help you tap that intelligence and to get you in the best possible relationship and communication with each other, so everyone is becoming a leader. So that's the fun part for me, is that it's kind of exactly the opposite of the example you're giving, but it sure exists.
Now, there's something so organic to what you're talking about, and why I feel that's important for our listeners to know is that you see so many companies that are out there that facilitate leader training workshops, and I love a lot of these words that they like to put into their programs because, well, it's funny that way. But you take a look at this, and their training materials and the like, and you realize, why are people taking what inherently is very simple to do and complicating it so much? Is that so that you're forced to be led in the dark until you come to see the light? I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
I don't know why my mind jumped to this kind of. I mean, I think you're absolutely right that there is. I mean, I have to watch out for it myself. That in the process of trying to teach something that really should be, as you're saying, organic and native human intelligence, if we hadn't gotten so far conditioned out of it, like all of our conditioning is into separateness, right?
Right.
Individualism, separateness. We've, except for some native cultures, I want to say, there are some non-mainstream cultures that haven't lost this, but we are so conditioned into this paradigm of separateness, and then learning it as a legalistic issue. I mean, I went into one city government company, very diverse group, racially, economically, and they so loved everything. They were, there was a Hispanic man in tears saying, "I've been waiting for this for 25 years. We know this in my culture. This is human to human. It's getting back to being human together." And then the director, who, I'll just say the director, was so, she absolutely, even though the evaluations were extremely high and positive and people wanted more, she said, "We absolutely can't do this. We can't have someone crying at work. That could lead to a lawsuit." You talk about,
which I know is true, but
which is true. And so, it's not to say that we're not all trapped in that culture, but the example I thought of when you were talking was actually, and maybe this is going back to the basic humanity, a high school classroom. There's a young man in his 30s, and teaching honors English and English classes in high school in a large Midwestern U.S. city. He is applying matrix in his classes. And to the students, he said they consider it somewhere between reality TV and group therapy, and they love it. Mm-hmm. And what they will say, and they will say whether it's an issue that's come up in the school or among their peers, or whether it's something about somebody's writing, and they will say, let's matrix this, by which they mean let's sit down and talk to each other about it, and let's get let's support each other, and let's get our differences in. And that's an example to me. It's this teacher is being invited to teach it to other teachers now because he's got 100-person waiting list to get into his class. Mm-hmm. I mean, when he first started it, the kids called it the feelings class.
Right.
And it is not an easy A, and they know that, So it's like they're learning to get back to what you're pointing to, the basic humanity of talk to each other,
mm-hmm.
Respect each other. We're in this together. We can only go forward. Desmond Tutu said that. And we can only go forward together. We can't, it's not going to work anymore to do this, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, or, so I think it is. And I'm going to take something from what you're saying, Daniel, that I'm always putting myself on notice to try to teach this and explain it more simply. And some of your examples really point to that, because it is just getting underneath all that conditioning. and getting back to being for each other, and with each other. And we're all in this together, so let's, make the best of it.
I know that in more than 15 years of broadcasting radio, it's been astounding the many things that I've been able to experience through wonderful guests such as yourself, and the things that emerge, and you really wished you could go out and wave a wand in some cases and change the world. You really do. For instance, you just brought up the classroom. A great place I could see Matrix really being applied and being effective, but then what disturbs me is the way that our education system is set up. And it's set up, well, especially, I think there's a documentary, it's called Waiting for Superman, that really touches on this.
Oh, I saw that, yeah.
Yeah, so you know what I'm talking about, how these people and this teachers union that's embedded itself into our government, in such a way that really new things just can't come in, and the ultimate end result, which is what I always talk about on this show, let's look at how effective what you're saying is, or what effects does it have. That should really be the end result. And you see what the effect of the end result of the way they're doing things is. Kids are dropping out of school like flies. What is it, almost 70% now, I'm guessing. And most of that's in the first year of high school. And that's really sad. And then you think about the bitterness this poor child has about wondering, do I stand a chance? And then it's even worse thinking that you go to college now, you're strapped with student loans, so now America isn't the place of opportunity. It's the place to basically go into debt and bury yourself. So the hopelessness that goes behind a society, as a result of that, and you see that these old systems just don't work anymore. And that should be what we should be looking at. So you look at matrix leadership, and you see this teacher's implemented it. You see that it works. That should be the goal. Oh, it drives me nuts sometimes, the things that I hear.
Well, I mean, every teacher that I get to work with, and I think it's, of course, some of the most important work there is, they all complain about the very things you're naming and the standardized testing and how much these things rule their classrooms. And I know there are people, I know other bodies of work, there are people working really passionately to bring in more social emotional intelligence into the classroom. There's neuroscience now to really support that learning happens best in connection. It does not, competition impairs learning. I mean, there's healthy competition, of course.
Sure.
But the kind of cutthroat competition that puts everybody into the same mold and only recognizes one of the many types of intelligence, of course, impairs learning, and it has all the consequences you're naming and worse. So absolutely, if we can, whether it's matrix or other things that are getting students, adults, kids, all learners into connection with each other and learning collaboratively, then, of course, and I have to say, my son, who's in college and had so-called learning disabilities, I like to call them learning differences, in grade school and high school, is thriving in college, A student, political science, and part of that he's in classrooms that are small enough with professors that are smart enough to get them all, learning collaboratively, where they're all working in teams, and a lot of it's based on class discussion. And so I do see some hopefulness. There are people, more and more people, who are really trying to change this, and it's essential. We're not going to get out of the, the horrors of the mass shootings in schools, and then, all of the ways that students are ostracized, and we're not going to get out of that until we can generate a highly inclusive, socially, emotionally intelligent classrooms.
And I don't touch on that too much when you talked about the shootings, because I think media's done a fantastic, sloppy job of making sure that we don't forget it. But it's necessary to remember to hopefully prevent it from happening again. But I think maybe they're missing the potential motivation behind that. What do you think?
When you say the potential motivation behind that,
because it's usually at a school this occurs. I don't know. It's just maybe I'm stretching too far there.
Yeah, no, you're not. I mean, I just don't know how much time we have. It's a very complex topic, of course.
Yeah, not that I really wanted to expound on it.
Yeah.
But, you know, maybe he's going in to shoot up the school because he's frustrated because he has to go to this class every day and he's not being heard.
Well, you know, all of the complexities included, including our media and our gun control laws, I will say, to scale it back, to a much simpler example that I spoke with I believe, 5th grade teacher who had a classic bully in the class who was very ostracized and becoming quite aggressive with the teacher and all sorts of other things we probably don't have time to go into. But I always look through a matrix lens. I look through, you know, because every voice, every role is expressing something on behalf of the system, of the whole. So I look at what is that bully expressing for the whole group, for the atmosphere. You know what, and as I did a little more, got her to talk, this teacher to talk a little bit more, sure enough, this kid was in a wealthy school district, didn't have money, many things were going on, didn't fit in the standardized testing mold. The kids had to be in class at 7 a.m. And I said, well, maybe the other kids don't dare express that frustration, and this one person, this is another matrix principle, is being the conduit of the expression for all of that frustration. So, of course, when it's only got one valve, you know, one pipe, one place to be expressed through, it's going to be amplified. The charge is going to be way amplified. And, you know, there are other group therapists like Ernie Mendel who talk about group roles, and one of the ones he names is the terrorist. Like if the system won't open up any other way, right? Then somebody's going to get the system to open up. So it's
and it's really no different in the workplace as well. It's the same thing. You got a troubled employee. You know, and it snowballs. Not that there isn't people that really should maybe be in the world of work, who knows, but, you know, generally you get somebody who's cruising along, he's been there for a bit, you know, doing her thing, and the next thing you know, they turn into a bad employee. Well, I don't know, I think that really starts somewhere. Because, as I suggested to you earlier, I had people not only willing to come to work on their days off, but if I called and said I needed you, there were certain people, you couldn't get them to answer the phone at all. But if I called, look, I need you for an hour, 2 or 3, could you help me out? I'll be there in 15 minutes. You know, and these were people that wouldn't even pick up the phone for anybody else. And so I thought, okay, great. I'm just glad these people respect coming in enough. But that comes back to what you're saying. It's that organic ideal that we're all in this together. You know, let's be sure that we're on open ground about how we feel and what we think about each other, but, you know, with respect and tact all at the same time.
Well, what you're pointing to, Daniel, is it's such a fundamental shift in consciousness, and you're pointing exactly toward the shift from seeing everyone as individual or separate, and so therefore that challenger or that employee who's trouble at work or that disruptive kid in the classroom or the family is a, quote, problem, right? If we're on island of me thinking and looking at through that lens of separateness, which we're all conditioned into, then we're looking at, oh, that person challenging me or disrupting this is a problem. And instead, through a lens of being interconnected and being a living system in a group that, you know, is a team, there's no matter how someone is challenging me, for example, right now, I am listening through the lens of what is that person expressing for the whole. And if that person is challenging something, probably there are others who feel the same way who aren't speaking, or there's something in the environment or in the job or in the culture or even in the way I'm presenting it that is, you know, making this more challenging. So I listen now not from what's wrong with you or what's wrong with me. lens or get with the program. I listen from the lens of what is this person expressing for the whole. Mm-hmm. And people give me feedback over and over again, and what you are describing, that your behavior, was the same. You were seeing this isn't just this person. This is something going on in the workplace or in the culture. And, people expect teachers to use their authority, in my case, or get defensive on both sides.
Understood.
And people tell me all the time, oh, my gosh, you just are meeting every voice with such love and acceptance and interest.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's all part of the intelligence. And that doesn't mean, of course, that somebody might not need to leave. It may not be the right job for them or the right, workshop.
Mm-hmm.
But it certainly is a different, fundamental shift in consciousness to look at a family, of course, as it's not this problem kid, but what is this kid expressing, that the others don't dare. So it's I love, Daniel, I'm really enjoying just how it's as if, well, not as if, I really get that you've been embodying these principles and discovering them on your own for many years. So
well, we can't live our day past halfway if we don't learn something.
That's right.
That's how I like to end my show. Now, Amina, here's one thing. We'll touch on this for about a minute, and then we're coming to the end of the show. But
sure.
What is, to you, in your experience as you facilitate these workshops, what seems to be the favorite part for the group?
Favorite part of the group?
No, for the group. As you're facilitating these workshops.
What's the favorite part?
Like kids, they like to go to lunch when they go to school. They like PE, but when they're doing your workshops, what seems to be the one that they get really excited about that you see consistently?
Well, we just finished one in Portland last week and have a longer training coming up in Portland starting in May, and one in Ashland, Oregon, in April. And I can reference these ones that have just happened. And even though we do many types of training activities, people actually love the best is sitting in groups and getting to talk to each other and learn these practices of really talking in the open, getting the intelligence in the room. And they love how much they learn and how supported they feel. And they go away with a palpable, felt sense of being interconnected. And for most people, many people have never really, truly felt it, as a functional reality.
Mm-hmm.
So even though we do many other creative types of training exercises, they love just being able to be in those groups and get that sense of interconnectedness and walk away with it. So.
Yeah, fascinating stuff. I think sometimes, too, the inherent nature that maybe most of us aren't really being heard. Maybe we're being listened to, but we're just not being heard, and there is a difference.
Yeah, very
that if
different.
you could just have that possibility, maybe psychotherapy might just kind of wane to the backside somewhere. Who knows?
Well, I could do a whole other show on that.
Yeah, we could talk about our government from the Matrix point of view as well, I'm sure.
Sure.
Some of it works well, and some of it leaves you scratching your head like, how do these people still have a job from day to day? Who knows?
Absolutely.
Now, Amina, if you could, for our listeners, is there a website people can find out more about this?
Yes, there absolutely is. It's matrixleadership, one word, .org. And it's filled with probably too much writing, but also they can go into, there's archived e-zines, articles that are mostly excerpts from my book, and I probably am going to have a book published this year. It's with the peer review readers right now. Will either be this year or early 2014, but right now the website is a great resource. Lots of descriptions of the workshops and trainings and how to find us if you want consulting for your company. And as I said, we are teaching in Portland right now. So there are workshops and free preview evenings happening in Portland and Ashland, Oregon right now.
Mm-hmm.
And I love coming out there. But yes, it's a great resource. Even just reading what's on the website and reading some of the articles gives a lot of information.
So matrixleadership.org is the website, folks. You can find out more about this. Send your boss, and if that's not enough, send yourself as well. You're both in this together. Just remember that. Amina, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to have you here on the Beyond 50 radio program.
Oh, thank you, Daniel. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you for having me.
Very good. We want to thank you, the listeners out there, for tuning in as well. Be sure to visit us at our blog spot. That's Beyond 50 Radio, the number 50, beyond50radio.blogspot.com. We do have a free weekly e-newsletter that goes out. We'll have a hot link about this Matrix experience there for you as well. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you again for tuning in. This is the Beyond 50 radio program, and remember, live your day past halfway.